The pilot of Caprica, a 2010 TV science fiction series that started a few months ago, turns to nature and to what is natural by understanding both as boundaries that need to be overcome so that we can explore the novelty of avatars and cloned beings in the context of the old conflict between good and evil, between good people and bad people. What is natural is experienced as already fixed laws. We want to break them because they limit us. At least in science fiction, any law in nature can be overcome to redesign at ease what is natural. We go beyond the natural. We react to it. We contrast it. The fantastic is opposed to what is natural. At a recent lecture in Paris, the prestigious French anthropologist and philosopher Bruno Latour, currently scientific director and professor of the Parisian Institute of Political Studies, described natural law as turning to the laws of nature by assigning to them the responsibility of defining what is good and what is evil. For him, natural law is a caricature of nature, understood in legal terms, and at the same time, it is our caricature as moral agents, as if we believed naively that nature provides us with clear normative insights sufficient to shape and direct our moral action in a detailed way. These two anecdotes exemplify two current trends, two contemporary ways of understanding natural law. Before addressing them, I mention a third anecdote. In a public conversation with the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas at the Catholic Academy of Bavaria in Munich in 2004, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger affirmed, quote, "Natural law has remained, especially in the Catholic Church, the key issue in dialogues with secular society and with other communities of faith in order to appeal to the reason we share in common and to seek the basis for a consensus about the ethical principles of law in a secular, pluralistic society. Unfortunately," continues Ratzinger, "this instrument has become blunt. Accordingly," says Ratzinger, "I do not intend to appeal to it for support in this conversation. The idea natural law presupposed a concept of nature in which nature and reason overlap, since nature itself is rational. With the victory of the theory of evolution, this view of nature has capsized. Nowadays, we think that nature as such is not rational." End quote. It is a surprising statement on the lips of Cardinal Ratzinger. It indicates his critical stance toward natural law based on the transformation of nature because of evolution. But a few years later, in 2007, as Pope, Benedict XVI affirmed that, I quote, "the inalienable value of natural law for a real and coherent progress of private and the social order." And then he added that natural law, it provides us of particular principles that regulate ethical justice on the right and duties of everyone, and that it is a truth which, by its very evidence, immediately imposes itself on everyone. End quote. Finally, in 2009, in his last encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth, Benedict XVI wrote, quote, "This universal moral law provides a sound basis for all cultural, religious, and political dialogue. Thus, adherence to the law etched on human hearts is the precondition for all constructive social cooperation." End quote. To summarize, after having affirmed that natural law is a blunt tool and that should not be used in conversation with the contemporary philosopher, in more recent interventions, both in occasional speeches and in his last encyclical, Benedict XVI understands natural law as a theory that, in today's world, allows us to articulate specific norms in a deductive way because of its metaphysical consistence, and that promotes the equality of all human beings. Such an understanding of natural law is classical in Roman Catholic tradition and can be found in many documents of the magisterium. Now, it seems a very bad way of beginning a lecture on natural law. I look at the popular media, watching the science fiction Caprica. I turn to the academy, listening to an important French philosopher. I listen to an important theologian, now Pope. But we are far from being illuminated in our understanding of the relationship between nature and natural law, and on the relevance of natural law in addressing contemporary ethical issues. My only hope left now is in moral theologians, in light of their research, their experience, and their discernment, and in common people, again, because of their experience and their discernment. Natural law has received an increasing international attention as a moral resource. In any continent, scholars reflect on it, and they inscribe themselves in the long tradition of research that started centuries ago and that gradually articulated what we now call natural law. I do not want to retrace this history here now, with all its turns and twists that are part of the history of moral theology. Major scholars already contributed to this historical research. Among them, I name the German Jesuit theologian Joseph Fuchs, who taught in Rome, the Belgian Dominican Servet Pinkers, who taught at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, and today, the contemporary American theologian Jim Porter at Notre Dame. In his very recently published volume, A History of the Catholic Moral Theology in the 20th Century, Professor James Keenan leads his readers to a very fascinating journey to discover these turns and twists, and also the transformations that occurred in moral theology and in theological ethics in understanding natural law. The renewed interest in natural law comes from different quarters. Conservative scholars, like the political philosopher Robert P. George, who delivered the Boise Center 9th annual prophetic voice lecture here on campus a few weeks ago, and who follows the scholarship of John Finnis and Germain Griset, turn to natural law and find in it support for a well-defined political agenda by deducing from it specific precepts and then political decisions on sexuality and sexual practices, as well on a few bioethical issues that concern the beginning of life and the end of life, like abortion, euthanasia, and stem cell research. At the same time, more liberal scholars around the world turn to natural law because they find in it a theory that supports interdisciplinary interaction and that promotes one conscience, reason, and ability of discerning, deciding, and acting. To put it briefly, we can ask, is natural law a chameleon theory that changes its colors according to the surrounding environment and at the wits of the proponents and supporters? Provoked by my three opening anecdotes. First, I define natural law. Second, I propose 6 ways, briefly, to get to nature and to natural law. They are via negativa, a negative way; via positiva, a positive way; the law, universality, relationality, and finally, how natural law works in a pluralistic and globalized world. Third, I apply these 6 points, 6 insights, to a concrete case, and I've chosen torture. And finally, I end by indicating 6 future directions of research, even more briefly this time. So let us now begin by looking at how do we define natural law. To give you a little international flavor with an Italian twist, I turn to Enrico Chiavacci, an insightful, well-respected Italian moral theologian from Florence. He is an 84-year-old priest, brilliant, extremely direct, and heavy smoker. Many would say this is a quite unnatural way of reflecting on natural law. With him, I briefly defined the Thomistic understanding of natural law. His rendering of natural law is not particularly original. We could turn to Jim Porter, Lisa Cahill, Steve Pope, Jim Keenan, and many other current scholars who work on Aquinas, and we would find a very similar rendition of natural law. Natural law depends on a unique formal precept: do good and avoid evil. This, and only this, is the principle of moral life. That is evident. It is analogous to the principle of non-contradiction in the realm of our speculative abilities. This tells us that there is a fundamental orientation to the good, and as believers, we can add to the greatest good, that is God. On the contrary, moral evil is when we do not answer to this call to the good, when we negate our orientation to the good. This principle defines the original moral experience that makes us free beings, able of acting freely. And it concerns every human being. Together with it, there are 4 very general inclinations. We can call them general directions, according to which we can direct our life to live out what is good. They are not evident per se, but every person can deduce them and can experience them in various ways. They qualify us as rational beings by focusing on 4 dimensions: our subsistence, our reproduction, our rationality, and our sociality. They qualify the key dimensions and values that characterize us as human beings. Being very general, these 4 inclinations do not lead us to articulate specific precepts for the concrete choices that we have to make in our lives. It is up to our conscience, reason, and experience to come up with those specific precepts that help us to act in the best way by promoting our personal and social well-being. Chiavacci invites us to remember that for Thomas Aquinas, the natural law, in all these 3 components, the principle, the 4 inclinations, and the specific precepts, is what we can discover and understand by ourselves, with our natural abilities, with our reason. For this is called natural. But there is something that goes beyond it, that Aquinas calls the eternal law, and that indicates what is dear to God, what God aims for humankind. We can understand it and experience it as an interior call, as an invitation to be part of the divine positive project for humankind. In our daily lives, with our conscience and reason, we are invited to figure out what we can decide and how we can act doing what is good. It is with our nature that we decide, without knowing fully the future steps ahead of time. We proceed in the unknown, in fidelity to conscience. It is an expression used by Gaudium et Spes. And to reason, fidelity to conscience and reason, and also in light of our experience and of what we find trustworthy, so that we can answer what we understand as God's call for us, what is our responsibility, our task to make the world better. From the point of view of theological reflection, this concerns all human beings, as I said, and not only believers. Hence, natural law is not a series of specific and particular norms, but an open-ended normative source for those who want to act in a conscientious and reasonable way. How does this definition help us? How do we get to our human nature? What do we find there, and how it helps us to live well? To answer, let us go back to the three opening anecdotes. By examining what I indicated as 6 keys to understand natural law. The first key, if you want, the via negativa, the negative way. The show Caprica contrasts human nature with what is fantastic. This is the only way in which the show tells us we can get to our human nature. The limits of our nature are overcome by the possibility of creating an avatar, that is, through technology, an auto-generated self, existing only in an avatar-like world that will become populated with avatars. It is a negative way to get to nature. Maybe even natural law uses a via negativa. We can say that even in what is fantastic, by contrast, we can glimpse what is positive. Can we do the same even in the case of evil? We might agree that in the case of every person, the guiding moral principle is do what is good. But we do not forget that our personal history and the history of humankind tell us that the moral imperative, do good, is tragically inseparable from the story of how we did not avoid evil, both personal and structural evil. Having experienced what radically contrasts with what is natural, that is evil, it is even through it that we can glimpse something about human nature. Even through a via negativa, we can proceed toward what is good. As my third anecdote indicates, even in the case of Benedict XVI, what was a blunt tool became an elective tool for moral life, for promoting human rights and human dignity. The second key, via positiva, the positive way. In the second anecdote, the French philosopher Bruno Latour suggests with irony that there is a direct way to get to nature. At least we can play with the idea. As Schiavacci indicates, we define natural in 2 ways. First, human nature, our rational nature, becomes the tool to understand God's personal and social call and to find the right answer to the multiple situations that we face. Human rationality shapes our practices. It is helped by our affections, our experiences, our wisdom, our virtues, and by our interaction with all the other moral agents. The second suggestion that Chiavacci makes is that human nature is situated in the larger natural context. It is in creation. The whole cosmos then becomes the place where we discern about the precepts needed in our ordinary life. So with this tool and with this place, we can ask, can we really know nature, creation? Can we know the human nature? How do we know both? What is the validity of what we know? Let us begin with creation. First, in dialogue with scientists and with philosophers of science, after Karl Popper, we are well aware that scientific hypotheses need to be verified, proven, and confirmed. Hence, in dealing with nature and in trying to understand it, our vulnerability, our fragility, our fallibility are exposed. Instead of hindering us, this awareness moves us forward. It has shaped human progress since the beginning of human history. However, our knowledge is truthful but provisional. Second, our knowledge is conventional and arbitrary. As such, it requires continuous adjustments and improvements. Ethically, this humble awareness is a good antidote against the presumption of finding in nature all the norms that we need for our daily decisions and actions. We gather that our understanding of nature is not only provisional, conventional, and arbitrary, but it is also tentative. Now, after creation, if we turn to human nature, I think we agree that to know, to define, and to describe our human nature is even more complex. We need to express it in intelligible ways. We need to express in intelligible ways our relationship with ourselves, with others, with creation, with God. We know well that we are in continuous transformation, from the biophysical to the spiritual, relational, psychological, and psychic point of view. Then, any understanding of and definition of our human nature is situated. It depends on the context and on the conditions, as well as on culture. Some authors draw the conclusion that the only realistic ethical approach depends, then, on the situation, so-called situation ethics, and is forcefully relativistic. I disagree. To be aware of the provisional, tentative, and situated character of our understanding of creation and of human nature, I believe is our starting point for continuing our research. Striving to understand does not mean that we are advocates of situation ethics and of negative relativism. Instead, it shows the importance assigned to ethical realism. Finally, Chiavacci reminds us that the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium Spes in particular, asks the question, what is the human? And it answers to it by pointing to what we are called to do as individuals and as humankind. I think this is quite insightful. We answer ethically any question about our identity, about our human nature. And in an analogous way, we learn more about creation by taking care of it in a responsible way. The third key, the law. If you go back to my second anecdote, we notice a second irony. Bruno Latour tells us that by looking at nature, natural law finds laws and determines norms to guide our ethical choices. Even in the more recent teachings of Benedict XVI, we find a similar point, this time quite seriously, without irony. I reply by examining two aspects. First, we might agree that natural law as such does not lead us to articulate particular norms, but it leaves us that to our conscience, our reason, and our experience. Then we can ask ourselves whether there are particular situations in which, on the contrary, because of their gravity in damaging our nature, our dignity, our rights, our willingness to protect ourselves and others should lead us to articulate a few specific precepts. The prohibition against incest, rape, murder, adultery, racism, pedophilia are only examples, some examples of actions that we could say should universally considered evil because they threaten us as persons in our essential human inclinations, in our being. They always compromise personal and social flourishing and personal and social well-being. In various ways, in a direct way or indirect way, they threaten our subsistence as human species, our ability to procreate, our rationality, and our sociality. Secondly, on an international level, we are aware of the political difficulty that represents trying to reach a consensus on what should be done in critical situations, both in ethical and legal terms. As an example, when genocide occurs, or when the state authority is not able to protect its citizens or to avoid harming them. An example or a reflection on this topic is the debate that in a few weeks will take place here on campus on the responsibility to protect citizens when nobody is defending them. It will involve two of our colleagues here at BC, Professor Alan Wolf on Political Sciences and Director of the Boisi Center, and the Jesuit moral theologian David Hollenbach, Director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. This highlights how, on an international level, searching for the good is rooted both in who we are as human beings and in political structures and legal dynamics that we can set in place. With Chiavacci, we can say that internationally, a historically renewed understanding of natural law implies a search for consensus, for common action, maybe even common laws to address the major ethical issues that affect today's citizens. For this, we need agreement on a reasonable finality, on a set of shared reasonable values and practices, an extending discussion in civil society and in the political sphere, an assessment of pros and cons, and an oversight on the means and the procedures used to implement what has been identified as a priority. Hence, an ethical position that is grounded in natural law leads us to discuss political, national and international priorities aimed at pursuing the good of the citizens, particularly of those in need, of countries, and even the common good of humanity, by pointing at the need of a specific targeted legislation. For Chiavacci, this brings us back to the origin of natural law, because for Thomas Aquinas, the natural law was articulated also to counteract, in a critical way, the presumed absolute character of civil laws. We can call this the critical political purpose of natural law. It allows us to judge any civil law and to verify what we should do as citizens, deciding whether to follow these laws or not. But natural law should not be understood as a body of norms that an authority imposes on its subjects. This would undermine the centrality of the Thomistic intuition that treasures conscience and reason in every person as a participation of the eternal in ourselves. The fourth key, universality. We are all human beings. We all share the same nature, but we are so different at the point that each one of us is unique. Can our nature lead us to determine something that is ethically valid universally? What does it happen to our particularity, locality, and individuality? In defining natural law with Chiavacci, I indicated before that it does not lead us to articulate specific precepts, but can we come up with universal norms? This is another matter highly debated today. We have the privilege of having here Professor Lisa Cale, who has been one of the major participants in this debate, while Professor Jean Porter at Notre Dame stresses the difficulty of reaching moral consensus on principles accepted universally because of particularity. Professor Lisa Cale sees concrete possibilities for achieving moral consensus on human rights, women's rights, and the environment, in light of human values that unite us, while we aim at transforming our reality, at making it more just. The competition between Notre Dame and Boston College continues not only in the football field, but also in theology. Who will win this time? Of course, we wish BC will win again. Contributions to this debate on universality come from all continents, and they indicate how our reflection on what we share ethically is marked by particularity. The two African Jesuit moral theologians, Agbon Kianmege Orobator from Nigeria and Jacquinot as top from Cameroon and currently in Kenya, promote a theological sensibility that indicates how, by being deeply rooted in our cultural context, with all its narratives and values, by retrieving them carefully and by interpreting them theologically, we can access to ethical resources that tell about us and that guide us forward beyond our local cultures. The Brazilian Redemptorist Márcio Fabri dos Anjos reaffirms the role of conscience and of a strong commitment in favor of the less well-off in society, in the world, to actuate the preferential option for the poor and to challenge power dynamics. Though he speaks from Brazil, he believes that his insights are shared across the globe. Finally, women theologians from all continents write on the ethical issues that we face because of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in today's world, and they do it together. They ground their call to justice in what the theological tradition calls human nature, by avoiding understanding it in any individualistic or specific local terms. They point to the liberating ethical power of human experience. Fifth key, we are close to the end. Universality, it is the key of relationality. A few years ago, In their overview of the theological European contributions in moral theology, Jim Keenan and Thomas Kopfsteiner noticed that most Europeans shared a theological approach that emphasized relationality as a key moral resource. A few years later, this continues to be true, even when we focus on natural law. Aristide Fumagalli, an Italian moral theologian from Milan, is an example of this approach. He proposes a relational interpretation of natural law. He suggests that first, natural law articulates the essential importance of relationships in our personal and social life, and it sets the limits under which we are threatened as human beings. At the same time, it allows us to avoid any reductionist attempt, like in the case of naturalism, rationalism, legalism, voluntarism, culturalism, because all of them betray natural law. Fumagalli agrees that natural law does not provide us with specific norms for our daily life, but it allows us to define what is essential, and it does it in a relational way. Moreover, natural law translates the core of the biblical tradition, that is, creation and alliance, that express God's relationship with us and our response. Second, in reading Gaudium Spes, Fumagalli noticed the importance given to both the gospel and natural law in searching to promote the common good in our world, as to suggest that the gospel's command to love leads us to articulate in a concrete way specific precepts that are inspired by this commandment. Relationality is not solely a theoretical approach, but it implies participation and collaboration. Hence, together with many associations and organizations, the Roman Catholic Church plays a positive role in providing inspiration and direction, in forming the conscience, and in supporting just practices against any individualistic and solipsistic tendency. But we, I think, must remember that this positive role might be seriously undermined and even gravely compromised if the Church's ethical way of proceeding is not outstanding. If she is not able to renew her moral practices and dynamics by making them more attuned to the Gospel's loving perfection and justice. If she reduces the natural law to a set of written precepts undermining people's conscience and reason. If she relies on exercising authoritarian power instead of serving in an evangelical manner. The scholarship of Joseph Fuchs on natural law, with all its changes and evolutions, confirms the centrality of the role assigned to personal conscience and rationality on contentious matters. My sixth and last key. The three opening anecdotes miss another trait that today characterizes natural law in an international perspective. It is the willingness to rethink natural law in today's pluralist and multicultural context. I could mention conferences and publications that indicate this. Let me focus only briefly on two examples. First, the conference proceedings of a 2007 conference held in Milan, edited by the Italian moral theologian Giuseppe Angelini, revealed the attempt of a group of Italian theologians to recover what Angelini calls the exhaustion of a category of natural law. And they want to renew it in an historical, anthropological, and personalistic way. in dialogue with cultural and religious traditions. The second example is that in search for universal ethical reflection and agreeing on the urgency of finding shared values to address contemporary social issues, the International Theological Commission in 2009 published a document on natural law with the title "The Search for a Universal Ethic, a New Look at Natural Law." The Commission writes that human reason in all human beings, independently of culture and religion, can discover fundamental human inclinations that yield specific and objective moral precepts. Natural law is considered a relevant, inductive resource in a pluralist context because it helps to articulate an objective universal ethic. But the Commission does not help us to understand how we move from these general inclinations of natural law to specific precepts, and what role plays the cultural and religious diversity. Moreover, the document of the Commission highlights the relevance of natural law on social and political issues, but it is scanty in discussing the contribution of natural law on issues concerning sexuality, gender, and bioethics, where the magisterial use of natural law is mostly deductive. The Commission hermeneutical methodology of turning to human experience, to anthropological reflection, and to contributions that come from philosophy, from religion, and wisdom traditions promotes cross-cultural dialogue and common ethical research, because it shows the ability to recognize the valuable contribution that come from all cultural and religious traditions. In commenting on the document, the Italian moral theologian Giannino Piana points both to the tension between the deductive and the inductive approach. And also it points to the document's choice of applying natural law mainly to social issues, forgetting the others. The natural law can reveal its ethical richness as a relevant cross-cultural moral resource. But in order to make a strong case for its cross-cultural relevance, we need to be clear on how we understand it and how we go from the general principle and the four general inclinations of natural law to concrete precepts that guide moral life in all its aspects. It needs to be proven convincingly that natural law is neither used as a blanket to push a specific agenda, nor as a predetermined way of approaching highly debated moral issues in which, even agreeing on the general inclinations, there are disagreements on the concrete ethical approach on single issues. This list of 6 characteristics of natural law, I believe, could lead us to articulate concrete precepts. And I want to test it concretely by reflecting on a very specific issue: torture. Recently, Professor Kenneth Himes spoke and wrote on torture. First, he used a via negativa approach. We may not know what is required by natural law, but torture teaches us what is forbidden. When we see what torture does to us, to our human nature, we see how it reaches out to our nature so deeply, and it devastates us. Torture breaks our nature, our humanity. It reduces us in pieces. It also leaves us with a very limited and scanty hope for recovery. Maybe after a very long therapy, we can attenuate the gravity of the consequences on our personality, our character, our bodily identity. So, this via negativa leads us to a via positiva. We did not know that at the core of our human nature there was a solidity, a strength that torture did not break, and that helps us to recover gradually, at least partly. A Caravaggio painting with its chiaroscuro, with the shades and the lights that portray the characters and the scene, illustrates beautifully the unity between the via negativa and the via positiva, between what is negative and what is positive. Together, they allow us, both the via negativa and the via positiva, to get to our nature and to the whole creation. Tragically, the darkness of torture makes brighter our human nature, even when previously it was often barely distinguishable. And the brightness of our nature gives light to the unnatural and inhuman character of torture. Thus, the via positiva teaches us to ban torture. With Professor Himes, we agree that there are no situations in which torture should be accepted. Not even in the famous case of the ticking bomb, when we need to get the essential information about it to avoid an explosion and its consequences. But in making it law, should we fix this moral precept in a national and/or international law? In the case of an affirmative answer, which type of law? With limitations or unconditional? Should we argue from natural law because of what torture does to human nature? Should we declare that torture is always wrong and that we should avoid it at any cost, no matter what are the political and military gains we are expecting in using it? Moreover, in order to protect all people, should we rely on the universality of moral norms and some possible legal applications of them by deciding that anybody, anywhere, and for any reason at all, should never be tortured? Natural law leads us to discuss the possibility and the moral opportunity of taking a normative stance, even universally binding and unconditional. Our responsibility to protect those who cannot defend themselves could lead us in this direction. Further, this decision is made even more urgent when you consider that as human beings, we are involved in a relational way. We are connected. We are related. What happens to my fellow beings has an impact on each one of us. When it undermines their humanity, it is our own humanity that is affected. Relationality stresses how one's own personal well-being and flourishing is always inseparable from that of many people, of the whole humanity. What does relationality mean in a world of torturers and tortured people? Finally, in today's pluralistic and globalized world, we must be wary of moral exceptionalism. Those nations that believe that, and only they, can torture, and they claim rightly, are most in need of a universal prohibition. Hence, the 6 keys, traits that I indicated earlier and that characterize natural law theory today, it seems to me, could really help us to frame key questions and to identify specific precepts that shape our moral actions as individuals and as a society. My conclusion looks to the future. I propose 6 directions of development for natural law. First, the recent historical critical retrieval of natural law has been extremely important. We still need this historic work. In particular, we'll look for a further attention to Thomas Aquinas, to the following scholastic period, to the manualist period, and to the more recent contributions in line with the historical work done by Jean Porter, Jack Mahoney, and Jim Keenan. Second, this historical study could stimulate our reflection and renewed application of natural law theory to issues that we face today. The dialogue with sociobiology and with evolutionists like Professor Steve Pope is doing, with environmentalists and biotech researchers, could help us to rethink anew, as theological ethicists, our understanding of human nature, moral agency, and our relationship with creation. Third, natural law should be associated with the other ethical resources that help us to frame and shape our ethical dynamism, like virtues, in order to promote personal and social well-being and to advance justice and the pursuit of the common good in today's world. We need to promote ways in which personal and collective experience can contribute to shape the theoretical reflection on natural law and to articulate specific precepts in an inductive way. Fourth, Lisa Cale, Margaret Farley, and Christina Traina can be named among the scholars who have articulated a feminist, critical, renewed understanding of natural law and a retrieval of natural law. In the whole field of theological ethics, we still need the enriching scholarship of feminist scholars in all fields: fundamental ethics, social ethics, sexual and gender ethics, bioethics. Fifth, the German moral theologian Eberhard Schopenhauer has explored how natural law, despite its ambiguities, by being historically situated, provides insights to reflect on human nature and to promote human dignity. This line of reflection and research has been pursued also by other scholars and might benefit from further insights, particularly in light of threats to human dignity that affect the most vulnerable in so many countries, by showing concretely the relevance of the preferential option for the poor. In reflecting on bioethical issues concerning genetic research, biotechnologies, and the environment, the German theologian Dietmar Mith has pursued a similar line of theological inquiry with a heightened sensibility for interdisciplinary conversation and for articulating and promoting human rights. Sixth and last, natural law is a foundation for articulating human rights. A renewed approach can balance both deontological and teleological emphasis. We should address first how biotechnologies are transforming our understanding of human nature and creation, and also look at the rights that they may challenge. Second, we need to protect people whose rights are socially and politically threatened and compromised in new ways. For example, in the case of immigration, internal displacement for insecurity, social and political unrest, or for environmental issues caused by global warming and natural events like earthquakes and flooding. In such a way, we promote rights that protect individual and social freedom, as well as rights of solidarity that stress each one's need of being helped. Hence, natural law leads us to strengthen and support human dignity and human rights for the promotion of justice and the common good. Thank you for your patience and attention.
I'd now like to invite Professor Lisa Sol-Cahill to make her response. And after Professor Cahill's response, we'll be open for questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you, T. Frank, and thank you very much, Andrea. It's delightful to have you here. Because we'd like to have time for some more conversation, I'm going to make my points very quickly. And I have 4 points of appreciation and also 4 points of emphasis. So first of all, one of the things that I really like about your paper, Andrea, is that you look at a lot of different concepts of natural law, showing why or how they were sometimes used to deconstruct the idea of natural law and how they're sometimes used to promote it. And in many cases, often what we find in a discussion of natural law is that the author either just has a simple deconstructionist agenda or a simple defensive agenda with regard to natural law. And so I appreciate the nuance and the breadth of what you gave to us today. The second thing is that you gave us an international picture. And we here in the United States all too frequently are in dialogue only with other people in the Anglophone world, even just North Americans. So again, to broaden the picture out to the European debate, also you went into the African and Latin American literature. That's really fantastic. The third thing I really appreciate, but I'm also very much in line with myself, as you noted in your paper, with your ultimate position, which is that we do well to retain natural law, but that it has to be revised. And so what you're proposing is natural law understood as an open-ended normative source. And I think that is such an important message today in contemporary philosophy and also in social ethics in a global environment. Often the prospect and the reality of cultural diversity leads us quickly to discount the possibility of universals. And when we read literature that, as you cited, is coming from Latin America or Africa and other places, those were two that you mentioned, we find that instead of a rejection wholesale of natural law, there's frequently an appeal to concepts such as the full humanity of women, that would be from feminist theology, or a common human nature, or our humanity, or even human rights language. So there's definitely still a need in our contemporary environment for some sort of moral language that can bridge differences. And so the value and the challenge of natural law thinking is to try to make it serve that purpose. The fourth compliment that I want to pay your paper and to develop a bit is your use of Benedict XVI, later in your paper, the document of the International Theological Commission, and also some of the work of Cavacci on Aquinas, to present a model of natural law that is essentially Thomistic. And again, as you noted in your paper, that's something that I very much would also agree with, so I join in that project of trying to develop Aquinas in a contemporary context. So you gave us, I would say, 2 or 3 basic things that Aquinas brings, and I'll just repeat those quickly and then emphasize a few things and then move into my constructive comments, which have to do with emphasizing aspects of this model. So Aquinas as a model for discernment. The most important thing that it's important that we should note and recover today, I think, is that Aquinas' model is really an inductive model. So he says that there's one self-evident precept that we know kind of automatically through the nature of human reason, and that's simply that everybody should do good. But we don't have any content to that. What is the good and what is evil? So Aquinas works more inductively and appeals to human experience across cultures. Everyone in every culture preserves human life, procreates and educates the young, seeks to know the truth, lives cooperatively in society, although the basic forms of that will vary a lot. And that's what Kivaki was also reinterpreting for today. So I found that very useful. So the inductive methodology. Another thing that maybe didn't come out quite as strongly in your paper, but I think it's definitely in there, is that Aquinas recognizes contingency, and therefore the variability of the specifics of natural law when we get down into concrete decision making. So this is the reason, you mentioned the virtues, but the reason through which we know natural law is practical reasons. So the virtue of prudence, making good decisions and discerning the right means to an end, or what is the right proximate end in the circumstances. That's all very contingent and historical and calls for the virtues, but allows for flexibility and pliability as well, and cultural difference. One of the things that Aquinas allows for, but which maybe we could bring up again today and ask whether he's really radical enough, is change. So Aquinas says that there can be some change in the precepts of the natural law, although not the basic ones. And there's a lot of literature out there today that's pushing that even further. For instance, asking about the relation of nature and technology, and whether it's easy to separate nature and artifice, and whether technology and technological change is even part of human nature, part of the human body, part of the human person, part of human communities. The British theologian Peter Scott has a new book coming out on this topic. Now, in addition to just the general reality of change, I would also like to emphasize another big sort of issue, or to me, I guess, a value or a reality. And then building out of that, I'm going to make my 4, additional emphases, maybe going a little bit beyond Aquinas. So the general point is that Aquinas talks about the natural law in terms of reason and reasonable discernment of what is fulfilling for human beings. But I think today we would recognize that reason is very much embedded. It's embedded in our social context. It's, of course, embedded in our own embodiment. It's embedded in history, and it's interactive with our affections and emotions. So just to recapitulate those kind of quickly as 4 things. First of all, reason is interdependent with the affections, emotions, and imagination. Secondly, it is interdependent with embodiment. Thirdly, it's interdependent with sociality, and then a counterpart of that, fourthly, with historicity. So just on the first point quickly, reason and the emotions. There's a lot of literature out there, as I know you are already aware, developing the importance of the emotions as actually having a cognitive value. So sometimes your gut reaction can lead you into a process of reflection where you understand better what the moral stakes are in a situation. Ed Vosick at our School of Theology and Ministry has done some work on this, but a particularly salient author on Aquinas is Diana Fritz-Cates, who has a new book out on Aquinas and the emotions. The second point is that reason is very much embedded in our sociality and in our historicity. So any knowing of the natural law is contextual and limited and partial. But I would also emphasize that it's not only limited, it's always almost inevitably biased, because we look at things from the standpoint of our own community, group, and historical situation. So what that really strongly demands is a corrective component in this inductive process, consisting in critical dialogue with other persons, other communities, other cultures, and even other temporal eras as we read their works and reflect on what the wisdom of the past brings to us. You ask a question, or you make sort of a point toward the end of your paper. It's on page 17 in the text. But you make the point that it needs to be proven convincingly that natural law is neither used as a blanket to push a specific agenda, nor as a predetermined way of approaching highly debated moral issues, in which there are disagreements on the concrete ethical approach. Okay, and so I would say that the answer to that need, or the way to prove that natural law can overcome bias, is to actually engage in dialogue, in dialogical inductive thinking, and then let that influence the results. So when you just get results that are already predetermined, then you are lacking a dialogical process and a critical process that can overcome bias. The third issue there was embodiment. So our reason doesn't operate sort of abstractly from our personal physical reality, a physical reality that we share with other human beings. One angle that you could take on that is to look at, as you mentioned before, the findings of evolutionary biology and psychology. So human reason is influenced by certain evolved traits that we have. So traits toward survival and competition. Yeah, so we have to do a normative discernment process. To what degree are those traits consistent with human flourishing or destructive of it? So embodiment, again, influences reason and calls for a critical process. But embodiment also gives us some of the most clear bases of intercultural agreement. So you mentioned AIDS, for instance. So the AIDS virus kills everyone unless they have a biological, a genetic trait that enables them to be resistant. Everyone needs clean water. Everyone needs food and shelter. In feminist theology, I think that although there's certainly a lot of discussion of the cultural construction of the meaning of the body, there's some basic physical realities that call for moral responses, such as rape. And what does that mean? We can talk about killing in war and people living in conditions of violence. So I think embodiment really leads us into the foundations of the natural law in one of the most clear ways possible, that there's a basic recognition of what it is to be human through human embodiment. Certain conditions of life are necessary. And then just to conclude, I'll make one final point that goes beyond Aquinas and really brings us up into the modern period and to a special challenge in the modern period. So if we're talking about natural law, what people will usually say, I think, if they disagree that there are universals, is they'll say that there are different visions of the good life, and people don't agree on human goods. And I think that that's not really true. Just as we've been saying, human beings everywhere value the preservation of their own life, the ability to marry and to raise a family. Everyone values living cooperatively in peaceful societies. So it's not so mysterious what the human goods are. The really difficult part is equality, that everyone is equally entitled to seek these goods or to enjoy these goods. And in fact, equality as a component of the natural law is not part of the tradition. It's not part of Aquinas. It's not part of Aristotle. It's really only a modern insight. We find it in Kant's Respect for Persons, for example, and then in all these modern natural law theorists, including those who are related to liberation theology and so on. So to me, the most difficult challenge for natural law theorists today is to defend and then advocate for basic equality, which we seem to treat as self-evident, but it's not self-evident in the way societies are constructed, even if those societies are in theory liberal and democratic. Look at our own society here in North America, for instance. Continuing sexism, racism, violence, and predation. So I would just then conclude by again reaffirming what you're doing. I very much appreciate and applaud your attempt to reconfigure natural law as a language that can help us in global cross-cultural discourse. And you have laid out the groundwork to recover that basis in a critical, international, and very expert way. So thank you. And I'm sure we'll have more comments.